How did this terrible creature come to be? Hate alone was not enough. It took another ingredient, love poisoned by betrayal, to bring so much bloodshed and woe, to create the Onryo. That quote goes so hard. And it comes from Netflix's series Blue-Eye Samurai, which is a superb exploration of the damage that is done by being defined by the gaze of another. So today, I want to talk about Blue-Eye Samurai, and specifically the character of Mizu and the character of Ringo, and how they play off each other during the first season, and what I took from Mizu's journey during Blue-Eye Samurai. Welcome to Actually, It Is That Deep. This is your spoiler warning. Everything will be spoiled. No holding back. If you haven't seen the show, this is your final warning. Okay, let's go. We're going to start with what defines Mizu, and it's in the title of the show. It's in the first time you see her with those yellow glasses on. It's in the flashbacks where we see her as a child. It's her blue eyes. Her blue eyes make her stand out within the homogeneous society of Japan at that time as a completely anomalous person, a person of mixed blood in a land where there should be none of that. And her whole life is defined by the way that others look at her, how their gaze hits her, in the words of Sartre. We're going to start a little out of sequence with the show and start our discussion with Mizu as a child, which is explored during flashbacks. Mizu the child is introduced to us in a village as a kid who is being bullied by a gang of young boys. She is an orphan who lives by eating out of the scrap heaps of the village. And the leader of the gang of bullies says to her, "You have round eyes, like a dog." In addition, the gang of boys thinks that she is a boy because her mother had said to her, "You must be a boy. They cannot see a girl. Bad men will come and kill you." So Mizu lives as a boy, and she's bullied for her eyes, which is her mixed blood heritage. And she comes to believe that she is lesser because of the defining gaze of those who are looking at her, as Sartre and later Fanon write in their philosophies on this topic. So let's explore that briefly. Jean-Paul Sartre's concept of the gaze describes the moment when a person becomes self-aware not as a subject but as an object seen by others, reduced to how they are perceived, judged, and defined from the outside. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre explains how this external gaze can strip individuals of their autonomy and force them to see themselves through the limiting perspective of the other. Frantz Fanon, building on this in Black Skin, White Masks, explores how the colonized subject internalizes the dehumanizing gaze of the colonizer, especially in racialized contexts. Fanon writes of the moment when the black body is fixed by the white gaze, rendered hypervisible, alien, and inferior. In Blue-Eye Samurai, Mizu's blue eyes are that racialized marker, a constant reminder to others and to herself that she is other, not truly Japanese, and she internalizes this gaze as shame, as dislocation, and later as fury, a psychological violence that is central to both Sartre and Fanon's theories, and that becomes the philosophical foundation of Mizu's transformation into the Onryo, a spirit of vengeance, shaped as much by how she is seen as by who she is. Okay, so that's the defining trait, but we're still with Mizu as a child in the story. The boys bully her and she fights back. She's cowering on the cliffs, moments from getting killed, probably. Then there's this meteorite strike and the boys run away. Mizu stays where she is, pretty much in despair. And then comes the blind smith, sword father, as the show calls him. He comes for the meteorite metal and Mizu helps him take it back to his smithy. Their relationship is one of the most beautiful in the show because she sneaks into his house and she sleeps there. And then the next morning, when he's sitting in front of his fire and he's making his fire and so on and so forth, he says, "It would be really nice if someone were to make tea." And Mizu knows that's addressed to her. And so their whole relationship is built around this. It would be really nice if someone were to bring the tongs, hammer the metal, and so on and so on. And it is this very, very sweet relationship. However, more importantly, his blindness symbolizes a space where Mizu cannot be seen, where no one's gaze can define her, where she has the capacity to grow into herself. Now, Mizu is driven by thoughts of revenge against her father. Essentially, she thinks that in destroying her father, who made her of mixed blood, since her father had to be one of the 4 white men who were in Japan at the time of her birth, this will bring her peace. And so, while being apprenticed to Sword Father, she also learns how to be a sword fighter. And finally, she says to Sword Father, "I must go, I must claim my vengeance." And he says to her, "You are not ready. You do not need to do this." And here we see Mizu engaging in bad faith in a very real way. She says she has no choice. Vengeance drives her. But she absolutely does have a choice in this moment. She could choose to remain as Sword Father's apprentice. She could live a full and honorable life, but it would require giving up her vengeance. And so she denies that choice, refuses that path, and leaves his home and returns to the world. And I think this is a good place to break away from the show and speak briefly about free will and bad faith as defined by Sartre. I always mispronounce his name. Sorry, Sartre. Now, I'm always of at least 2 or 3 minds when it comes to free will. Do we really have the freedom to choose otherwise than what we would choose? Or are we just cheerleaders who rationalize our decisions that are already made by everything that shaped us, our history, our trauma, our biology? Maybe free will is just an illusion that follows action. But even if that's true, even if freedom is uncertain, for the sake of morality, for the sake of how we live together as a society, we have to act as though we have a choice. Sartre certainly thought so. For Sartre, freedom is essential, and as he says, we are condemned to be free. That's why he talks about bad faith, when we pretend we have no choice in order to escape our responsibility for our situation. We claim we're being forced, that we must do something, but that's often just hiding from the weight of the choice that faces us. And that's exactly what Mizu does when she tells Sword Father that she has to go. She doesn't have to go. She chooses vengeance. She could have stayed. She could have lived a quiet, dignified life. But that would have meant giving up the story she's built about herself. Ringo, as we'll see next, is the reminder that there was another path. So let's talk about Mizu's foil, Ringo. Here we pick up with episode 1 and our introduction to the show and our introduction to Mizu. When we meet Mizu, she's in an inn and she's wearing these little yellow sunglasses to disguise her eye color. Also in this inn, there's a man with no hands called Ringo, who is the server and the cook. And he is a very important character, which we'll get to shortly. So, our blue-eyed samurai, Mizu, wants information from a flesh trader who is at the inn, And in the exchange of the flesh trader to get the information, she, as a byproduct of this action, saves Ringo's life. Lord, that was a complicated sentence. I hope you followed that. Anyway, so Ringo now feels that he's indebted to Mizu, and he is so impressed with how she seemed to act to protect people that he immediately decides to give up his job and follow her and become a samurai despite having no hands. Ringo is a very interesting foil to Mizu because of that handlessness. He was born without hands, as Mizu is born with her blue eyes. Both of them were born in a way that makes society look at them as defective. Both of them suffer the gaze of society upon them. But what Ringo shows us is that it doesn't have to turn out the way it did with Mizu. It doesn't have to become the case where you are hell-bent on denying who you are. Because that's what Mizu is doing. With her drive for vengeance, she seeks to kill that which made her. Ringo, on the other hand, feels driven to be great at something. He has a positive vision for who he wants to be, whereas Mizu only has a negative vision of what she wants to destroy. Okay, but now Ringo's gaze on Mizu is of course far kinder than the rest of the world, but that doesn't mean it's as neutral as the Sword Father's was. Ringo puts Mizu on a pedestal through his admiring gaze, and that comes with its own burdens for her. Okay, so Mizu and Ringo set off to find Mizu's birth father and kill him, which of course is the purpose of the whole show. And along the way, they cross paths with Taigen, who turns out to be the bully from the village. He is now a samurai, and he has been betrothed to Princess Akemi of one of the samurai clans. So he is living a golden life. But then Mizu fights him and she beats him. And this, of course, is such a great dishonor to him that he loses his potential betrothal to Akemi, as her father will no longer allow Taigen to marry her. And so Taigen sets off on his own quest of vengeance against Mizu. Now, I'm not going to delve deeply into Akemi and Taigen in this episode, because in the second episode on Blue Eye Samurai, I will specifically talk about their journey and how they mirror each other and the philosophical messages we can draw from that. So in this episode, I'm very briefly going to skim over them just in terms of how they impact Mizu. Okay. So our girl Mizu beats Taigen. She's got some information on her quest to find her father, and she continues on her journey with Ringo still in tow. And along the way they come to a festival, and at this point Mizu accepts Ringo's presence in her life, and she buys him a bell because Ringo is capable of being very stealthy. So she gives him this bell and says to him, wear this, so that she obviously knows where he is. And she says, when you take this off, I will know that you no longer wish to serve me. Okay, so this bell becomes a symbolic item. Remember it, it will become important. Okay. Mizu has accepted Ringo as her apprentice. And there's the festival, and Ringo learns during this festival that in fact making soba noodles is not a thing he is as good as he thought. There are people who make soba noodles better than his. But he doesn't let that get him down. He still continues with his quest for greatness, or at least to touch greatness. He continues to positively define himself. Now, let's talk about the pivotal moment for Mizu and the death of dreams. Okay. So the 4 claws come for Mizu, and though she wins the fight, she's heavily injured. Taigen finds her, and he helps her get back on her feet along with Ringo, because Taigen wants her well enough to deal. So while they're all waiting for her to heal, one of the people that she's looking for on this quest to find her father invites her to come to tea and promises her information to find her father. Now this is obviously a trap, but Mizu goes into the trap with Taigen. And during that whole encounter, you can see clearly how driven she is by vengeance, by this denial of and this desire to destroy. How much she refuses to let go of that vengeance. Taigen keeps warning her, this is a trap, this is absolutely a trap. And she says, I know, but vengeance doesn't hesitate. Vengeance just goes for it. Long story short, she doesn't quite fall into the trap and she does get some information. But they have to escape using a pot lid to defend against arrows, which was a glorious battle scene. And then as they're going through the twisty canyon to get out, Ringo comes to their rescue. So all of that is fantastic. And that then brings us in Mizu's story to what is the most pivotal of the episodes, which is a double episode. Now, just on a side note about Akemi, she's done this whole cross-country journey and is now in a geisha house where our girl Mizu is about to end up looking for information as well. And the madam of this house has got a way into the castle where Fowler, who is the villain of the piece and one of Mizu's potential fathers, lives. Okay, so Mizu goes to the geisha house and she asks for information. And the madam says to her, no, I'm not going to give you that information. It's not worth my life to speak of it. But Mizu says to her, everyone has their price. What's yours? I'm a skilled warrior. And it turns out that the madam had a deaf-mute girl under her protection. And the local gang boss has claimed that girl, and he has the girl in his bed every night. I don't have to spell it out to you what happens. And so Mizu says, okay, so you want me to kill the gang boss? And the madam says, no. No, that would result in him coming to my place and burning my house down and killing all the girls under my care. No, I want you to kill the girl. She doesn't deserve to live in such circumstances. And that is a very, very harsh exploration of the concept of the duty of care we owe people. Would you want to live in circumstances like that? When is it better to be dead than alive? Okay, so Mizu does it. She pays the price. She breaks into the gang boss's house and kills the girl. But on her way out, she has a brief emotional moment, and a boy sees her. And she doesn't kill the boy. She tells him to go fetch people, that there's been an accident. And because she does that, the gang boss knows who she is and who sent her. And he sends his gang to the geisha house and attacks. And that leads to a very, very intense battle scene and the best episode of the season. A truly phenomenal episode. And this is what happens there. We have 3 timelines. We have the present timeline where Mizu is fighting desperately against the incoming wave upon wave of these gang members. Then we have Ringo and Akemi who are helping her with that battle. Then we have the giant puppet play. Now, what we don't know at the beginning of the episode is that this is actually a future timeline where Akemi is watching the giant puppet show that is telling the story of the Onryo, but we do see the puppet show during the episode. And then we have the past storyline, which is told in flashbacks about Mizu right after leaving the Sword Father, but before the beginning of the show. Now, I'm going to start my exploration of this episode by first telling you the story of the Onryo, the giant puppet show, because it's going to be very, very important. So, there is the samurai who has sworn vengeance, and he's out to kill all of the Phoenix clan, and he is relentless in hunting them. Finally, he kind of thinks he's done, he finds a woman, he falls in love, and though there might be some Phoenix clan left, he settles down and spends his life in love. And then, after he has had a child with this woman, he discovers that she was once a Phoenix clan member. And he says, but how can this be? And she says, I gave up my clan. I am no longer that person. I don't belong to them. But he refuses to believe her, and he kills his wife and his child. Very much in bad faith, FYI. He could certainly have continued his happy life with them. Anyway, but his wife rises from the dead and turns into this angry, vengeful ghost called the Onryo, and she kills him. And this story is very important to Mizu's flashbacks, so let's cover those next. In the flashbacks, we go back to the period just after she's left Swordfather's house, and she has a terrible start to this vengeance business and is wounded. Injured and staggering, she finds the woman she thinks of as her mother. Now, Mizu had thought that this woman was dead, but she's not. She faked her death and essentially threw Mizu out to the wolves, and her mother returned to her life on the streets as a drug addict and a whore. So, her mother heals Mizu, and she gets Mizu engaged to a man so that he can take care of both Mizu and her mother. And so Mizu goes off with her mother to live with this man. At this point in the episode, you'd think that Mizu is the equivalent of the samurai in the giant puppet show. And that's true at this point. She's the samurai who has been turned away from her quest of vengeance by another. Okay. So she goes with her mother to this farm, and she marries this guy, and the guy turns out to be pretty chill, and they start to have a really good relationship. He doesn't force himself on Mizu. She slowly learns how to cook. She learns how to be a part of his life. They start to develop affection for each other. They have real conversations. And then she tells him about having to pretend to be a boy and learning sword fighting and all the rest of that. And he wants her to show him how good she is with a sword. And that's where it all goes wrong, because Mizu is very good with a sword, better than her husband. And this offends his ego, and in his rage, he rides away from the house. Back home, Mizu clearly prepares herself to submit to his expectations and his gaze, and you can see that in her preparations. She puts on makeup. She prepares herself to be a bride, to fulfill the role of a woman in her society. You can see all of that in her decision-making clearly as she essentially steps into his gaze, and she will become what he wants her to be. And then the guards show up, and they're looking for her. Someone has betrayed her presence at the farm. And it's not clear if it's her mother or her husband, because it could have been her mother. Mizu and Miku, her husband, had told her mother to do without drugs for a while, so her mother could have done it for the sake of money. It could also have been her husband, because he was angry when he rode away. And as she's standing there, and the guards are coming, she sees her husband approach the farm. And then she sees him ride away. And in despair, Mizu draws her sword, she turns on the guards, and she kills them all. And then her husband returns, and he says, "No, I was going to fetch help. I came back to help. I was briefly afraid when I saw them, but I came back." And her mother is trying to blame her husband and says that he was the one who betrayed her. Her husband says it was her mother, and neither of them express concern about Mizu. They just try to blame the other for the betrayal. Neither of them give Mizu any regard. And that's why it doesn't matter who betrayed her. They both betray her in the end. So Mizu's husband kills her mother, Mizu kills her husband, and this is where Mizu becomes not the samurai of the puppet story, but the wife. She has been betrayed and killed by her husband, and she rises as the vengeful spirit of the Onryo. It's a beautiful analogy for the price of vengeance and the continuing damage that it does. Alright, so how does all of this play out in the present? Well, Mizu defeats all of the guards who are attacking the geisha house. And then Akemi's father's guards come, and Akemi says to Mizu, "You'll defend me, right? I'm not going to go with these guys. You'll protect me." But Mizu says to the guards, "Take her." And that is also very symbolic of Mizu's very practical viewpoint and her own gaze on Akemi. She looks at Akemi and she says, "You would be better off fulfilling the role society has for you, because your role is a good role, so you should go do that." And so Mizu defines Akemi's role in that moment. And Ringo reacts to this very badly. He takes the bells off and he gives them back to Mizu and he says, "You are no samurai." And she tells him, "I never said I was a samurai. You did." And that is true. Ringo's gaze, while benevolent, did put Mizu on a pedestal. Her whole life has been defined by the way that people look at her. And she is forging her own life in a destructive way because of those gazes. This vengeance quest is driven because of her internalization of how people see her. And now we enter the end stage, with Mizu launching into the castle that holds Fowler in the hopes of killing him. So along the way to Fowler, Mizu discovers that Taigen has in fact been taken captive, and she actually does stop to rescue him. She doesn't just leave him there to languish in the cell. So that is a good moment of character growth. And following on from this, when it comes to the fight with Fowler, we have a real moment of character growth. So she's fighting Fowler and she's very willing to throw her life away. But because Taigen is most of the way to dead, she does actually make the decision to save Taigen's life and dives them both out of the window and away from Fowler and into the sea. Having come all the way up the castle, having defeated everything thrown at her, including a superb fight set to the tune of "For Whom the Bell Tolls," which is just such a good use of that music. Having gone through all of that, she still chooses to back away from the fight in order to save Taigen's life. And that is a real moment of humanity and a real moment of change for Mizu. Now, when next we see Mizu and Taigen, they're being pulled by Ringo up to Swordfather's house, and Swordfather nurses them both back to life. Ringo is still very angry with Mizu, obviously, but he did save her life. And then at Swordfather's house, she's starting to have this little relationship with Taigen, but then it comes out that she overheard that Fowler is planning on killing the Shogun. And this makes Taigen furious. And he says, "How could you keep this from me? Why aren't you doing something about it?" And he calls her a monster and he leaves to go save the Shogun. Because that's Fowler's whole plot, right? Is to take over Japan and bring Western culture into Japan. I might actually do a whole episode on Fowler and his plan and the philosophical themes fed by Fowler's storyline, because it's very, very interesting as well. Leave a comment down below if you'd be interested in that episode. Anyway, during the fight with Fowler, Mizu's sword broke, and she now needs to make a new one. And she tries to get Swordfather to give her steel to make a sword with, but he says, "No, I have no steel for you, not in the way that you are now." And she says, "Fine, I'll make my own." But she fails in the endeavor to make steel because she makes the steel too pure, which is a discussion that she's had previously with Swordfather about how steel needs to have some impurities, which you can very clearly take as a conversation that he had because Swordfather, despite not having eyes, knew what he was dealing with, and he saw Mizu not as a failure of society. His gaze was one of acceptance. And again, she could have had a home with him forever. She could have taken over his legacy. That was a choice she could have made, and she did not. And again, after Ringo fished her out of the sea, she could have chosen to stay with Swordfather then. She could even have chosen to go with Taigen and warn the Shogun. But no, she is still fixated on her destruction of who she is, on her vengeance. Okay. She and Swordfather have a conversation about an artist giving everything for art, and she goes through a very complicated ritual to make steel, including asking Ringo for help, which heals the rift between them, because she admits that she can't do it all alone, which is a growth moment. And in the end, she gives the steel to Swordfather, saying, "This is your steel, I'm going to go to Edo as I am, because either I will come back worthy or I won't come back at all." Which is a very, very samurai expression. Anyway, off she goes to kill Fowler along with Ringo, and they reach Edo or Tokyo just as Fowler is attacking with this massive army of gun-wielding samurai. So Mizu goes hunting Fowler, leaving Ringo to wait for Akemi by a sewer entrance, and she tells him to make sure to get Akemi out of the city. In the end fight, Mizu is fighting hell for leather, and she throws a lamp to the floor, and the whole place goes up in fire, right? This massive fire starts. And Fowler says to her, "The biggest city in the world is burning down as a flame offering to your vengeance. That is your white side speaking." And that is also very much another gaze. He is looking upon her as a white man and saying, "You are one of us in your vengeance and your cruelty." He is defining her as part of his tribe. And again, she takes this. She accepts his gaze as true. And she acts upon it to destroy him. But then he says to her, "You can only find the rest of the men in this place called London, and I will take you there." I'm paraphrasing, obviously. And so she spares Fowler's life, and that is the last shot in the season 1. We see Mizu sailing away from Japan with Fowler going to this magical place called London. And that closing shot really asks the question of, can Mizu ever define herself? Or will she forever be defined by who her father was? By who the people around her saw her as? Can she ever have a positive vision of who she wants to be and stop arguing in bad faith about what she has to do? And I think it'll be interesting to see how the writers approach that in season 2. And we do have confirmation that there will be a season 2. So I'm very much looking forward to that. But as for season 1, I would say that Mizu is solely defined by the vision of others and internalizes those gazes to the point where she can only define herself in terms of her destruction of the thing that made her other. She has no positive vision of what she wants to be. And that makes her both compelling as a character, and it also makes you feel a little sorry for her, that she is so much attached to the view of others, unlike Ringo, who has surely been called crippled, and yet defines himself by his desire to be great. He has a positive vision for himself. Indeed, Ringo returns to Swordfather and takes Mizu's place there. Again, like the foil he is, he chooses the path she could have had and rejected, even though she would say that she hadn't rejected that path. And that is why I say they are incredible foils for each other, and that the concept of the gaze, as defined by Sartre and later Fanon, very much plays into the themes of both Ringo and Mizu. But in the next episode, we will talk about Akemi and Taigen and their journey. So make sure you subscribe for that. If you're interested in exploring things I write, check out the epic fantasy series Sangville Chronicles. It starts with a hidden blade, which has been described as a medieval James Bond story. How I would describe it is my exploration of how the past shapes the future and whether the slippery road to hell of good intentions can be stopped before we actually slide into it by the choices we make. And this particular edition of the book has got a new cover art, all human drawn, and some spectacular interior art. Each book has got 2 pieces of interior art in it, and all of that is human sketched as well. Links to all of that on my website down below. And I will see you next month for Taigen and Akemi.